Hello everyone, and welcome to another LJT MTG video. Today I'm going to talk about something that I think needs to be talked about more, and I hope is interesting and relevant to at least most people. I'm going to talk about the points list and my personal philosophy regarding to most of those things, and a couple external things, but largely most of these opinions are my own and just are based upon my experience from playing the format for a long time. I was also a long time counselor for the format, and so I have experience in what philosophy I used to shape the format when I was part of doing that. For those of you who don't know, as I mentioned, I was a counselor for several to many years. I co-wrote the 10-point list that is the basis for the list we still use with Adam Price. We changed the list from 7 to 10, and it's been very successful since then. So that's a bit about me, my history, and what the video is roughly about. So one of the first things I want to talk about that I think some people outside of Victoria don't have an especially keen grasp of is sort of the spirit of the format. And I wasn't even around when it was created, but I've talked to and played with and against many people who were there when it was created. And sort of the key spirit of the format is that it was created so that people could play all of their favorite cards in a fun, competitive environment. And the competitive environment part is the key differentiator from Commander. Also, one of the key tenets is that there's no banned list, like functionally, like vintage ban list, sure, whatever. But if you want to, you can play any tournament legal card in your deck. And sort of along the spirit of the format lines, one of the things I was a big proponent of and was keenly aware of when I was on the council is that within the spirit of the format, no card should be like shadow banned or effectively banned or points banned, whatever term you want to use to it. I believe that goes against the spirit of the format. So with that out of the way, I'll go on to my next point, which is sort of a one sentence. What is the objective of the points list to me? And to me, the objective of the points list is to create a balanced environment where all the macro archetypes are playable and competitive, although not necessarily equally so. And so I'll go into a bit more detail on what that means to me. So balanced environment to me means there are a number of decks that if your goal is to win the tournament, you aren't just picking one of one deck. There should be, if your goal is to win the tournament, there should be, and it's a relatively unknown tournament, unknown field, you should be making a decision on which deck you want to play, either like what your favorite deck is or what your inclination as a player is, or what your sort of deck skill preference puts you into. There shouldn't just be one best deck. And then where all macro archetypes are playable and competitive, to me that means there's like aggressive at least one, ideally more aggressive strategies should be like tournament viable. Notably, when I say balanced, not necessarily every macro archetype should be like, I want to win the tournament, but you should be able to like win matches and potentially win a tournament, even if it may not be the sort of most optimal choice. But aggro, mid-range, control, and combo, and we have seen those definitions sort of change, like in terms of aggro, mid-range, and control, as sort of has happened in other formats, has happened in Singleton, albeit slower, that aggro and control are sort of just getting absorbed by the gelatinous blob that is mid-range. The mid-range cards just keep getting better, and they're getting better in sort of every direction. So like you're getting your aggro decks are just playing like the good stuff cards that mid-range decks are playing, because those are just the best threats. And likewise, like you don't need to play 6 mana cards to win the game anymore, when you can play 2 to 4 mana cards that win the game just as well. And so what those decks look like will change based on just how Wizards decides to design and print cards, and that's sort of something you mostly just have to accept and roll with. I think at a high level, trying to fundamentally use the points list to oppose design philosophy is probably not a realistic use of the points list, but yeah, that's a bit more nuanced, and maybe I'll go into more detail in another video, or if you have any specific questions, definitely ask them in the comments. I'll get into probably the meatiest section next, and probably the one most people are most sort of interested in and disagree on the most, which are the reasons to point a card. And I'll once again mention that this is my opinion, not even necessarily Trent or Liam's opinion. This is also not necessarily the opinion of the current council. This is informed by my experience as a council, but I haven't been a counselor in quite a while, so it might have changed since then. So to me, there are several reasons a card may get pointed, and the first one is probably pretty obvious, but I think people still misunderstand it, and that is it's really good, like too good. And so many of the cards that sort of have been on the points list for a long time and started on the points list fall into this category. Cards like the power 9 that are on there, so like the best fast mana, the best tutors, the broken blue cards, those types of cards all fall under this category. They're sort of too good to be free. Essentially, they like every deck would play them, and in order to sort of make the points list effective, you need a baseline of sort of the most egregious design mistakes to be on the list. So the bar for this is relatively tricky. Like the biggest difference between points is 0 to 1 by far, and it's not close. The difference between 1 and 2 is the next biggest, so on and so forth. Like the difference between 6 and 7 is not that big, but the difference between 0 and 1 is massive. So the bar to get onto the points list for me is very, very high. It also changes over time. I'll go into that a bit more later with sort of the recent philosophy shift, and I'll give you my opinions on that. But yeah, generally this bar for me is very high, and the card sort of needs to break a fundamental rule of the game at an incredibly efficient rate, like the aforementioned tutors, blue cards, fast mana, etc., or be best in class in virtually every possible matchup. And this is something that didn't exist for me previously when I was a counselor, but in interacting with the community at large, has sort of been an addendum to my previous stance on philosophy, and Psychic Frog is sort of the perfect example of this type of card. It's a really efficient threat, and the matchup spread where it's effective is just everything. Like there's no matchup where you don't want that card. It's insane against aggressive decks, great against control decks, amazing in the mid-range mirrors, and absolutely a brick wall against aggro. I may have already said that. Also great against combo. Just make sure I cover it all. But yeah, every matchup card is like best one or two threats in your deck. Definitely just love to see it in your opening hand every single game, no matter what. The next reason to point a card, and the one that once you have sort of the baseline of all the cards you want on the list, which is functionally where we're at now, is a targeted point on a certain overperforming deck or archetype. Once you have the format into a pretty good place, pointing cards for power level, to me, doesn't really make sense unless they print something especially egregious, a la some of the Modern Horizons 3 cards. And previously, as I said, my design philosophy changed. But I think for the most part, once you have the format into a good place, most of your points changes should be either trying to knock the best decks or archetypes down very slightly, or trying to help the decks and archetypes that are maybe slightly behind the curve, slightly. And this can be either pointings or unpointings. The efficacy of those is another pretty nuanced discussion, and one that I'm not going to go into like especially deep detail here. I may do another video on that, because I could talk for a long time on that topic. But I will say the cards that I believe should be pointed are either cards that fall pretty close to the above, like, really good card threshold. Like, they're a really good threat with maybe not quite the matchup spread, or they're a pretty efficient tutor or card advantage spell or fast mana, but not quite at the level of the other cards. Or something that I think should also be looked at when targeting a specific deck is a key card for the deck that has as little collateral damage as possible. Some overarching thoughts when making changes, and something I would love to see included in the rationale for changes is, how does this change make the format better? Does this change align with the spirit of the format? Is this pointing likely to achieve the stated goal? What are the external effects of this decision? And so I think there have been changes, or at least proposed changes when I was on the council, that when I asked these questions, even the person putting forward the proposed change, like, they were like, this card should be a point, But when I asked these questions, I was able to even change the mind of somebody who was pretty gung-ho to make the change in the first place. And I don't know if these are things that are necessarily being considered as much as they should be. And to me, these are sort of core things that should always be considered when making changes. And also, one of the reasons I don't like making an excessive number of changes at once, and I understand why there were so many changes in the last points update, because there hadn't been many for a while. There was a sort of change in philosophy. I think that was a pretty unique situation. But in general, I'd like to make fewer changes at one time, because the last two questions, is this pointing likely to achieve the stated goal? And what are the external effects of this decision, become much more complicated the more changes you make at once, because they're all related. And so it makes making multiple changes at once, especially if they potentially impact the same decks or deck, then it becomes very difficult to determine the outcome of those changes and what the repercussions are. Because when you make a deck worse, not only are you making that deck worse, but sometimes other decks get relatively better. And it's sometimes harder to see the sort of second and third degree impacts of your changes, especially if you're not actively considering that when you're making the changes. I'll mention some stated philosophies I've encountered that I don't agree with, and why. I don't believe cards should be pointed for emotional or enjoyment reasons. To me, those are both subjective viewpoints, and there are inevitably people who are on the other side as well, and then it becomes an argument like who should determine which side of that viewpoint is correct. And to me, that's just a pretty dangerous place to be in. You're essentially determining how people should enjoy the format, and to me that's not and shouldn't be one of the sort of objectives of the points list. Likewise, I've seen people suggest expanding the points list for diversity, to make people make more decisions when choosing their points. And this viewpoint also doesn't hold a lot of water for me. Players have to choose every card that goes into their deck. Not every deck plays 10 points, and that's okay. Every card, not just pointed cards, matter. Like choosing your threats that are unpointed is just as important as choosing your pointed cards, sometimes more so. It depends on the deck you're making and how sort of critical the pointed cards are to your deck. But to me, this is just sort of diluting the power level of the format sort of arbitrarily, and to me sort of goes against one of the spirit of the format that I mentioned previously. I'll get into the recent philosophy shift now. So the last points change in January sort of sparked a lot of debate, because it was a pretty unique change. Previously, very few, basically no quote unquote fair threats were on the points list. You could argue true name, but then we'll get into an argument of what does fair mean. But that's the only one that kind of comes close, I think. And with the most recent change, like cards like Minsk and Boo, White Plume Adventurer, Psychic Frog all went on the list. And I'm mostly on board with the idea, at least. I don't necessarily agree with all of those changes, but I think I'm like now fully convinced that Psychic Frog is just uh, a fits the bill for what should be a one-pointed card. I've adjusted my philosophy to include a statement that I believe Psychic Frog fits into, and it also was in a deck that was being specifically targeted, so it makes sense for various reasons. Most of the other cards were on for sort of a mixture of reasons too. They were like very strong and in decks that the council decided should eat a point. Because of the philosophy shift, there's unfortunately a lot of collateral damage with that one, but I think this one and potentially the next one as well, depending on what direction they decide to go, there could be some more collateral damage. But I think in order to sort of adjust to this new philosophy, it's somewhat unavoidable in the beginning, but it should settle out in the next few at the very least, I think. That sort of leads me into my next point just while I'm thinking about it. I didn't have this in my notes, but I want to talk about it before I sort of wrap things up. Once a card is pointed, because of the different reasons to point a card, and the goal is to create a balanced environment, just because a card is 4 points and another card is 4 points doesn't necessarily mean the council is trying to say those cards are equivalently powerful. Or just because Black Lotus is 7 and Ancestral Recall is 7 and Time Vault is 7, that doesn't mean those cards are equivalently powerful. It means that in the context of Canadian Highlander, the council's determined that the same sort of deck building restriction should be applied to those cards. Points does not equate to power. It's a somewhat determined restriction on deck building for a very specific format. And that's something else that I don't think people understand. Not everyone understands especially well. Like, I hear and see lots of people saying, well, this feels like a 1 point card, or this could be a 1 point card. But to me, there's no sort of key definition of a 1 point card or a 2 point card. To me, there are two buckets. There are cards which are points and cards which are not points. And within the bucket of cards which are points, there are cards that are like broken. There are cards that are just like too good. And there are cards on the list that are there because they go in decks that are too good, and the decks needed to be taken down a peg. And as a balance tool, this card was put on the list. And in terms of balance, I think it's an important tool to be able to use. But when looking at the points list, I think it's important to evaluate that because there's a bunch of 1 point cards, no one's trying to say that, I don't know, Reanimate and True Name Nemesis are equivalently powerful. They have an equivalent deck building restriction associated with them. And that's what that means, not equivalently powerful. All right. What I would like to see from the council moving forward. And I'm going to start by saying being on the council is largely a thankless job. All these people are volunteers and they're there because they're passionate and enjoy the format. And they've put in a lot of time and effort, not only in maintaining the points list, but in speaking with the community and dealing with a never-ending tirade of complaints. It definitely happens as a former counselor and as probably the most public-facing counselor when I was on the council. There's a never-ending flurry of complaints that get hurled at you because you pointed their deck, or you didn't point their friend's deck that they always lose to, or you're not making the right decisions, or you're not making decisions fast enough, or there's this really obvious decision that you should just make. And like, so I think there's probably not enough thanks given to the counselors for what they do across the history of Canadian Highlander, and especially now when the community is so large, and there's just 5 people in Victoria doing the job the best they can. But that being said, I would like to see some changes, largely not philosophical changes, but just like mostly communication oriented changes. I would like to see some form of philosophy or guidelines or something on how and why pointing decisions are being made. I'm not asking for something especially specific, just something like a one sentencer like I gave as to what the objective of the points list is, and maybe some of the reasons they choose to point cards would be satisfactory. Like if you take those 2 sections of my video, it's like one sentence plus a paragraph on why you point cards, that would be fantastic, and I think would solve a lot of the anxiety and sort of frustrations people have currently with the decisions. There's one thing to not agree with decisions, but there's another thing to not understand why decisions are being made. And at least for me, not understanding why decisions are being made is more frustrating than not agreeing with decisions. Like, I can totally accept that people have differing opinions to me, and I may not have made a decision, but if they make their decision and provide rationale for why they made it, it's easy for me to accept it even if I don't agree with it. But if I don't know what metrics are being used or why a decision is being made, and I don't agree with it, then it becomes much more difficult for me to accept the decision. Sort of along those lines, I would also like to see more thorough rationale provided with changes, especially if you're not willing to do the first one, which is provide some sort of philosophy or overarching idea. At least providing more detail on individual changes would probably make them easier to accept, and also is a good reference point to have on why decisions were made or not made or what have you. The last thing I'd like to see is some form of rough schedule. The most common timeline I've seen is every 3 months, so once a season. That seems pretty reasonable to me. Every 3 months, that's quite a bit of time. And that being said, I don't think or expect there to necessarily be changes every 3 months, but maybe some form of communication being like, we think the format's great, no changes, or we think the format's pretty good, we're considering X, Y, and Z, no changes yet, stay tuned in 3 months, or we've made changes A, B, and C, let's see how it pans out, or we've made changes A, B, and C, we voted on X, Y, and Z, but they didn't pass. Just something like that, I think would be really good, once again, to sort of curb the anxiety and frustrations around, like, we don't know when, how, or why changes will or will not be made. And so answering a couple of those questions sort of by default, I think would go a long way to helping people understand and accept decisions when they arise. That's sort of all I have in my notes, so I'm gonna wrap it up. But thank you for listening. I am happy to finally get this video out. If you interact with me now, hopefully you could understand more where I'm coming from and why I advocate for the decisions that I do, and sort of what the sort of metrics I use in the realm I'm in when I'm thinking about Highlander and the direction I'd like to see it go. If you enjoy the content, please consider liking and subscribing. And we definitely see all the comments that get posted on our videos. So feel free to leave a comment if you agree or disagree, or have any other ideas for the philosophy of points, or maybe even what you'd like to see from the format moving forward. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.